So this video is about psychology and First Nations people, and psychology has done some really bad stuff. So our focus is on First Nations people in Australia and what psychology has been saying about them. And I'm talking here about Aboriginal people and Torres Strait Islander people. Oh, and no, I'm not using the term Indigenous, and that's nothing to do with Pauline Hanson.
And I'm Indigenous.
He's Indigenous?
Yes, I am. I was born here. Where's my land if it's not Australia?
England?
We aren't using the term Indigenous people because it's widely seen as a contentious term, because it ties people's identities to their relationship with the colonisers. It denotes that person as being a colonised subject. The preferred terms are First Peoples and First Nations people, and the latter is the one we're using because it captures the diversity among people. They're not one people, but are many distinct nations. Now, before we get into this topic, we first need to go back to World War II and take a look at the theory of racial hybridity. Here was the view that one racial group was superior to another, and that any mixing of those two groups, i.e. through sexual reproduction, could damage the gene pool of the superior group. Essentially, these are the ideas contained in Hitler's Mein Kampf and led to the Holocaust. The work of psychologists and psychiatrists into eugenics was particularly influential on Nazi ideology. And here's a rather horrific example, the book by Karl Binding and Alfred Hoch, published in 1920, called Allowing the Destruction of Life Unworthy of Living. The book argued that for the good of society, certain people should be ethically killed, specifically people diagnosed as mentally ill. Under the Third Reich, psychologists became increasingly opportunistic and were happily working away to support Nazi ideology in their research so as to attain reward and recognition and access to additional research funding from the Nazi government. By the time of World War II, psychology had already fully established itself as a major proponent of eugenic theory. Paul Broca, Francis Galton, Gustave Le Bon, Herbert Spencer and Stanley Hall all stated in various ways that white people were the superior race and black people were the inferior race. Was that just an anachronism? Just a sign of the times? Well, we can bring it a bit more up to date and look at South Africa during the time of Apartheid, which didn't end till the early 1990s. There, the vast majority of psychologists supported apartheid ideology, and some were very active in that. Remember, apartheid was the system where white and black people were segregated in society, black-only areas, white-only areas, and so on. Psychologist Jan Smuts became Prime Minister of South Africa during the Second World War, and Smuts believed that South Africa should be a white man's country. And another psychologist became Prime Minister, Hendrik Verwoerd, in 1958. He enacted some of the most horrendous apartheid laws in the country. Other psychologists played a large role in propping up apartheid, producing pseudoscience to support segregationist practices, largely through perpetuating eugenics theory. But these psychologists didn't consider themselves as racist. They believed their work was value-free, objective, and scientific. Now let's bring things closer to home. Let's look at the eugenic policy in Australia. The restricting of non-white immigration to Australia was one of the first acts published by the Australian Federation in 1901. It became known as the White Australia Policy. A prominent feature of that policy were the laws authorising the forcible removal of First Nations children from their families. This was intended to absorb First Nations people into white society with the ultimate intent of the full removal of First Nations people from Australia.
the continuing infiltration of white blood finally stamps out the black color. The Aboriginal has simply been bred out.
These children are known as the stolen generations. The White Australia policy was premised on the eugenics research coming from, among others, psychologists, and that promoted the idea that white Europeans were racially superior to all other races, especially to First Nations people. And this practice went on from 1871 right up until 1965. And the White Australia policy wasn't fully rescinded until 1973. Now, curiously, you don't hear much about it when you study psychology in Australia, about psychology's involvement in this White Australia policy, but it's there. In fact, it was there from the beginning. Psychology started to develop as a major discipline in Australia at the same time as the initial implementation of the White Australia policy. And it's not coincidental that early on in Australia, psychology began focusing on the psychological characteristics of First Nations Australians in ways to support the implementation of the White Australia policy. Psychologists started using psychometrics to examine the mental capacity of First Nations people with the aim to construct a scientific case, however spuriously, for why First Nations people were inferior to white people. A prominent example of this is the work of Stanley Porteous. Other psychologists were busy measuring the intelligence of the First Nations people to justify their detention in missions and so on. So psychology at that time was immersed in the theory of eugenics. Now let's just stop a minute and remind ourselves of the history of Australia and First Nations people. Probably around 65,000 years ago, perhaps longer ago than that, Aboriginal people and Torres Strait Islander people settled in Australia. Then, in 1788, the first fleet arrives from Great Britain to establish the first penal colony, and that was the start of the colonisation of Australia. The colonisation was based on the premise that the land belonged to no one prior to the first fleet landing. This was established through the implementation of the legal principle known as terra nullius in Australian law. That was first implemented in New South Wales in 1835. It wasn't until 1992 that terra nullius was finally overturned. Colonisation resulted in the bloody slaughter of First Nations people on a massive scale. The estimates of the First Nations population at the start of British colonisation ranged from around 300,000 to 1 million. By the 1920s, there were believed to be only 60,000 First Nations people left in Australia. And that's why some people refer to this as a genocide. Let's go back to Zygmunt Bauman, because he gives us a useful way of thinking about how genocide happens. He says it happens when we lose our moral concerns about violent atrocities being committed against a large group of people, and that loss of moral concern happens when three conditions are met. First, the violence is authorised by official orders coming from the legally entitled quarters. Here the politicians argue that it should happen. Second, actions are routinized by rule-governed practices and exact specification of roles, and here bureaucratic structures are set up to enable it to happen. And third, the victims of the violence are dehumanized by ideological definitions and indoctrinations. Here, social categories, social identities, and so on are constructed and employed to categorize certain people in certain ways, such that some groups are identified as the good people and some the bad people. Psychology was one of the key players and a very active player in relation to Condition 3. Today, psychology is doing most of its harm to First Nations people by being inactive. Here's an important quote that provides a wake-up call for our profession. The failure of psychology to speak out on the forced removal of First Nations children highlights a more significant issue in this history. Psychology as a profession has failed to actively engage in policy analysis and formulation or to undertake any significant advocacy role on the behalf of First Nations Australians. Psychologists, on the whole, have failed to use psychological models and frameworks to provide policymakers, professional staff, and First Nations communities with any sustained analysis of the psychological consequences of the process of colonization, a process psychology was fully complicit in. So we're left with a legacy of racism in psychology. We've got the enduring and spurious work of Hans Eysenck. We've got Chris Brand, we've got Richard Lynn. The most recent person we've got is Jordan Peterson. They've all been determined to show black people as genetically inferior to whites. But this is not about the individual views of particular psychologists. It's not about demonizing those individual psychologists. We need to look beyond those individuals. We need to remember the lessons of the Milgram experiments. And what that teaches us is that we're not talking about a group of very bad psychologists doing some very bad things because they were very bad people. But what we need to look at is how the nature of psychology enables those bad things to happen and maybe even encourages those bad things to happen. And how a profession like psychology in Australia has been very bad for First Nations people. But also, until recently, it's been very silent about the bad things that it's done to First Nations people. So I'll leave you to chew over those ideas, and I'll see you in the next video. So till next time. Ta-da.